Welcome to the Darkstream, VoxDay, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. Just firing up the unauthorized chat here. DLive chat's already rolling. Audio is good. Video is good. And apparently I did not fire it up yet. There we go. Live chat is also rolling on unauthorized, and super chats are active. So, as you see behind me, I got a little package today. Pretty happy about that. And what it is a package of 36 black, high quality Italian goat skins. And what they're for is for our test bindings, which we're going to start doing the second week of June or so. So we're continuing to get closer. I had a good conversation today with the company that manufactures the gilding machines and also provides gilding services. We're planning on using the service, but their prices are a little bit higher than they should be, so we were discussing that. Some of the options, we actually found one of their used machines for about a quarter of what they sell for new. Another possibility. So that one we're playing by ear. We're going to go ahead and deal with the service initially, just so we're not taking on more than we can, not biting off more than we can chew. One thing at a time. But as you can see, the goat skins arrived. We're still waiting for the cowhide. Hopefully that should have been in like 3 weeks ago. So I'm still waiting to see what's going on with that. But we should have it in plenty of time. If not, well, people that happen to pick up test meditations will be getting a really good deal. So I just want to make sure we have something to practice on. So, and yeah, that's what's going on today. That's what we've been working on today. So it's been interesting. Over the last 2 weeks, I was kind of not really paying attention, but I just kind of half noticed as I was reading other things on the various news sites. I was like, Zelensky's in Poland, Zelensky's in London, Zelensky's in Finland. I was thinking, he's traveling a lot for somebody who's supposedly a commander-in-chief. Like, what's going on with this? It just seemed a little odd. I thought maybe, maybe he's, trying to convince some of the countries that are getting tired of supporting a losing battle. Maybe he's trying to keep them in the game and that sort of thing. But then he goes and shows up at the G7 in Tokyo, and says some very stupid things like, Bakhmut looks like Hiroshima now. It's like, no, a battle that involves a light infantry force does not compare to an atomic bombing. It's absurd. And it was also clear, even from the Hollywood crowd, that people are getting tired of his heroic routine. Everybody's supposed to be very impressed and clap and salute their bravery and that sort of thing. Well, people are tired of it. They're not. Nobody except for the neocons actually wanted a war with Russia. The U.S. military doesn't want a war with Russia. None of the European governments, none of the European leaderships none of the European militaries want a war with Russia, with probably the exception of Poland. But they have historical issues with Russians, so I think that's understandable. Foolish, but understandable. But it's become obvious now. People are beginning to realize that Zelensky's avoiding going home. And Seymour Hersh published an article today. I linked to it on the blog. And when you look at what has happened recently, I don't remember the guy's name, the guy who is the actual commander. Remember, while Zelensky was the titular commander-in-chief, he's the elected politician. He's not, he has no military experience. He's not calling any shots at all. Wow, we got a great super chat from West by Godbear. Very generous, thank you. He says, got my books in today and couldn't be happier with the quality. Cheers and keep on crushing. Very glad to hear it. Not on a super chat, but just on the regular chat, West by Godbear. What books were you talking about? Are you talking about like Jungle Books or Junior Classics, the regular hardcovers? I'm just curious. Because as you know, we've now got 2 separate shipping centers. So, no, not Kolomoisky. It starts with a Z, like Zugavny or something like that. Anyhow, nobody's heard from him in like 2 weeks. Yeah, Valerie Zakini or something like that. Another super chat from No Chance says, does Zelensky's green suit and theatrics confirm how desperate they are? Well, I think his theatrics do. I don't think his suit makes any difference. West by Godbear says he got ethics, politics, and discourses. Yeah, those are some good ones. I'm particularly pleased with discourses because that's a little bit more unusual. I mean, ethics and politics, along with rhetoric, are, in my opinion, the 3 must-reads by Aristotle. But discourses, I think the production team did a phenomenal job with the design, and the content is just unbelievably good. In fact, I personally think that the prints got intentionally pushed instead of discourses, just to keep discourses out of the awareness of young intellectuals. Discourses would have been even more groundbreaking and game-changing if I'd read it in high school, the way that Jerry Pournelle's There Will Be War series was for me. Anyhow, I'm very glad you're so pleased with the quality, and we are working on continuing to move it up from there. We'll keep you posted. Non-Zero Chances. I got Jungle Books last week. Just got a shipping notice for the first Talib. Yeah, they're doing a bang-up job. Right now they're focusing on getting the U.S. books out because that's the majority of them. But we're now working with a shipping company, and they're putting together a special arrangement for us for shipping to Europe, and so that should provide a little bit more reliability and speed to the whole process. So, would keeping the generals paid off last until their summer offensive? Yeah, they've got plenty of money to do it. They've got tens of billions. And so it was interesting that Hersh said that Zelensky is starting to worry that the generals might be thinking of replacing him. And they certainly will once his ability to keep bringing in money vanishes. I think if you look, I'm not making any predictions here. I think it's foolish to make predictions about wars for the most part because there's just so many uh, X factors out there. People say, "Oh well, look how wrong you guys were about uh, you know the Russians being able to take Kiev in 3 days." Well, they tried it, but they tried it with you know a, a single paratrooper regiment. They took a shot. It actually got a little bit closer um, than I think people thought. But when it didn't work, then they went right to Plan B. I've been reading Marshal Zhukov's autobiography, his memoirs, and aside from the incessant communist good boy talk, the real reason for our success was the staunch virtue of the people led by their commissars who, it's just like, okay, I understand you probably had to say that. Maybe you even believe it, but come on. But anyhow, one thing that's very clear about the Russian approach to things is that they're not afraid to fail. It was interesting reading Zhukov trying to talk Stalin into retreating from Kiev preemptively. And Stalin and a number of the other generals initially took what was a very Ukrainian Hitlerian style approach of don't concede a single inch. And then Zhukov gets put in charge of the reserve to help support them, talks to the guy commanding the defense, who says, "We can't hold this. We should have fallen back 2 months ago, a month ago, whatever." And anyhow, after a month of absolutely bitter fighting, Stalin finally agrees, "Okay, you guys can pull back." And it was the correct decision, later than it should have been made, but it was still the correct decision. And the Russians, the Soviets had all the same problems that everybody's had. Generals being too cautious, refusing to attack when their neighboring armies need them to attack, and that sort of thing. And generals get replaced for insufficient aggression, all that sort of thing. These things, these failures, these replacements of insufficiently aggressive generals, they're entirely normal. It doesn't indicate that a side is losing or winning. It means that a side is fighting. And I think the way that it's easiest to point out to the deluded Americans who still believe the Ukrainians are not only bravely fighting for freedom, but are actually winning. I think it's best to look at the previous examples. Napoleon actually took Moscow, occupied Moscow, and ended up marching back with his tail between his legs, and barely anyone survived. Hitler's armies drove deep into Russia. But what was really fascinating was that the whole idea of panic among the Stavka, the Russian Supreme Command Staff, was total fiction. And in fact, to support his contention that they thought things were actually going relatively well, despite the fact that they were losing incredible amounts of men and equipment, was that their whole goal was to just slow them down, make sure that they didn't go too quickly. And their forces did manage to do that even when they were being defeated. And so not only were the Soviets, Soviet strategists confident, Zhukov quotes some of the works, the post-war works of the German generals, and notes that they noticed the same thing. They were worried about the fact that they were not progressing quickly enough, which they needed to do because they knew that eventually Russia was going to, or the Soviets were going to grind them out, which is exactly what happened. The really astonishing thing was during the siege of Leningrad, which lasted 900 days, the people in the besieged city managed to produce tens of thousands of artillery units. I mean, they were producing so much weaponry that it was getting transported out of the besieged city on the water and being sent elsewhere. They couldn't even use all of it. Bilbo Swaggin says, do perverts make good generals? Well, Alexander the Great did. Julius Caesar did. On the other hand, Patton was very straight-laced. Wellington was a bit of a dog, but he wasn't a pervert. Napoleon, I think, was relatively normal. So I think that the that sexual inclinations and even degeneracy are arguably orthogonal to generalship. I do think, however, that it would be difficult for a modern general to be openly degenerate like Caesar, like Alexander, and still be obeyed. So, Harry Bear says, do you think the Russians are going to wait for the midterms to make the U.S. support moot and basically like the fall of Saigon? Well, it appears that something might be happening sooner. Again, I'm loath to make any predictions because I don't have enough facts on hand. I can't reach any rational conclusions. There's not enough information. But that being said, there are some hints and suggestions that the situation in Ukraine is going to rapidly turn for the worse, because that there's going to be either a regime change in Ukraine, which is why, if you think about it, Zelensky's ability to control things probably rested pretty heavily upon Zelensky. Now that Zelensky's out of the picture, and a number of other high-ranking generals and public figures are out of the picture for various reasons, I suspect that Zelensky doesn't have the support within the Ukrainian military that he needs to survive. They know what happened. They know better than any of us what happened. And if you look at how both the Ukrainian military and the NATO military were just sacrificed in mass for nothing, I think that the military probably blames Zelensky. Not entirely fairly. Zelensky's just doing what he's told. He's just a puppet. But who else can they blame? Who else can they, more importantly, who else can they reach? And so if you put the fact that Zelensky's biggest support in Ukraine appears to be either severely wounded and incapacitated at best, and may well be dead already. Um, the fact that he doesn't seem to be, he seems to be afraid to go back. Uh, he knows he'll be made a scapegoat, and so um, so it's I think if Zelensky doesn't go back within the next 2 weeks, we're going to see we're going to see the potential for some massive shifts. All of the West's diplomatic efforts have failed completely. China's made it very clear they're not going to side with the West in any way, shape, or form. And it was a big kick in the face when the Arab League permitted Assad to rejoin the Arab League. You know, Syria had been kicked out under Western pressure. Now they've invited him back, and so it just seems to me that we're seeing little glimpses, little indications of things behind the scene that something significant is going to happen within the Kiev regime. And hopefully, whoever takes over in Kiev will have the sense to break with NATO and surrender comprehensively to the Russians. That's the only thing that's going to bring peace. Static says, Vox, John Halmer says NATO is planning airstrikes against Russia this summer. Stu Peters' Department of Defense contacts say they're planning fireworks. I don't think that these gentlemen understand the nature of military planning. There are probably plans for NATO airstrikes against North Korea and China, but there's no intention whatsoever of doing it. The military has to draw up plans for all kinds of scenarios that it knows perfectly well are very, very unlikely. And the fact that they're drawing up those plans, it doesn't mean that there's any intention of doing that sort of thing. I can't imagine they would even try it, because the air defenses that the Russians have are the best in the world. They're better than the U.S. air defenses. And so it's very unlikely that the F-16s that they're talking about or anything else are going to survive very long in that environment. In fact, the Russian air defenses are so good that the drips and dribbles that Ukraine ended up with were good enough to keep the Russians from using much of their air superiority for the first year. One of the things that I find it very difficult to understand why people don't recognize it, but Russia hasn't really even been using its military. They've been using their air forces to a limited degree, mostly the cruise missiles. They haven't really been using their fighters very much. They haven't been using their bombers very much. They've been using their helicopters, and they've been using their artillery. But it's not an accident that these city battles, Mariupol, Bakhmut, they didn't even utilize Russian regulars. They're using, mercenaries and I mean, they're basically using mercenary light infantry. Wagner and the Chechens are very good light infantry, but they're not regular forces. They're not heavy. You know, the, it's not like the armored cav is engaging in much action there. And the reason is obvious. They don't need it, and they know they need it as a reserve in case NATO decides to go hot with them. Who says they're trying to make it look like Ukraine is now pushing on the Russian border. Yeah, that's ridiculous. They're not anywhere near it. I mean, that's what I pointed out is even when an enemy, even when an excellent enemy, a superior enemy like Napoleon took Moscow, that wasn't enough to win. Ukraine can barely even get into the Donbass, much less Russian territory proper. It's absurd. Um, let's see. I didn't understand this. Did you see how their rhetoric is going exactly as you predicted, Vox? Are you talking about the Ukrainian rhetoric? Because I think that's more or less going how I predicted. The Russians haven't really been engaging in much rhetoric. They seem to understand that they've got a fundamental disadvantage when it comes to PR, global media, and so forth. And so their best bet is just to keep it as straight and dry and dialectic as possible, which is the right decision, by the way. But anyhow, the indications are that the NATO forces, the NATO governments are running out of patience, they're running out of time. And they're talking about, oh, well, we're going to get the F-16s into action within 4 months. No, they're not. The only way that they can get F-16s into action is if U.S. pilots are flying them. And I very much doubt that whoever is calling the shots for the U.S. military wants to take that risk. U.S. credibility has already been damaged very, very badly. What we've seen, I said that I thought that the world was going to change when the first carriers were sunk. But economically speaking, the carriers have been sunk. Everyone, including the Russians, expected the grand weight of sanctions to harm the Russians. They expected that it was going to possibly even bring them to their knees and force them to wave the white flag. That didn't happen. The exact opposite happened. It broke the Western economies. It broke the U.S. economy. It broke the European economies because of all the debt. And it doesn't matter if the media tries to spin victory out of defeat. It's not going to make any difference. You can only lie so much before reality begins to insert itself. Jay Bila says, just going through Sun Tzu's Art of War, seems like Russia is following a lot of this strategy. I don't know about a lot of it, but certainly some of it. The Russians have a very sophisticated historical military art. They have uh, they're more serious about it than probably any other military. And so, um, some of what they're doing is actually quite new. And I think there's going to be some very interesting books published and analyses published in the next 10 years. Would the backlash, if the U.S. gets directly involved, be worse than the Vietnam War? Yes. There's no chance, none, that the American people are going to support a U.S. Russian war. None whatsoever. And it doesn't matter how much the Jews in the Biden administration want that war. Americans aren't going to support it. Frankly, I think it's more likely that if the NATO-Russian war is allowed to go hot, I think that that will bring about the collapse of the U.S. government. You know, there's no way that Americans are going to, because remember, the Americans who matter with regards to the military are the very people that are unvaccinated and have never had greater fear of and contempt for their own government, for the U.S. government. So that's not happening. Sam says the U.S. would support a Russian puppet regime before a war with Russia. Well, they've been trying that. I mean, that's Navalny, who was their guy, just got named a foreign agent. The U.S. is a ticking time bomb waiting for its melting pot to explode. The economic carrier's self-destruction. Yeah, you can see it. I mean, you can see it in England. You can see it in the U.S. It's not quite as bad in the European countries, although in the big cities in France, it certainly is. Hooten says a lot of U.S. boomers are still shell-shocked from the USSR propaganda, though. Yes, but the boomers don't matter. The boomers, I mean, frankly, I don't know that Gen X matters because we're all too old to fight. But Gen X is not going to let its children get involved in this. I absolutely wouldn't. I can't imagine that even my friends who got vaxxed and got their kids vaxxed and that sort of thing, there is no way they would permit that. Coffee Grounds Bear Colin Cut says, the feeling I get is the American people won't support any more, even though the left postures in support of the Ukrainian people. Even the left postures, but they don't want to fight either. No, of course not. Ladumba says, in Sweden, the gang wars are spiraling out of control too. Yeah, so it's going to, I mean, this is why all of the neo-clowns were saying that we can't afford to fail in Ukraine. Because they already failed with Russia, and that alone has brought about this economic crisis, the de-dollarization, et cetera, et cetera. And if Ukraine actually falls, despite these massive efforts by the NATO forces and by the NATO countries to fund it, that's going to send a very, very strong message to all the countries around the world that the Pax Americana is over. The imperial U.S. hegemony is over. The monopolar world, the New World Order, The rules-based world order is done. It's over. You know, and once that's clear to everyone, that's when the power struggle for the remnants starts. And so I think we're rapidly approaching some very, very interesting and perhaps dangerous times. You know, the U.S. is already post-democratic. I mean, the republic died a long time ago, but it's openly non-democratic. You know, its elections are no more convincing than the sham elections in Iraq or any other country with dubious election procedures. Static says, why do people call you a white supremacist if you don't support Ukraine while there are actual Nazis in the Ukrainian forces? Because white supremacist doesn't mean anything. White supremacist means a person who people who hate white people also hate. But also, the whole thing about quote unquote Nazis with regards to Ukraine is irrelevant. I mean, when Putin and Medvedev are talking about denazifying the entire world, they're not talking about swastika wearing people. They're not talking about Hitlerites. They're talking about the New World Order. They're talking about the imperialist USA. They're talking about the empire that never ended. They're talking about the neocons. Yeah. It's a rhetorical term, not a dialectic term. Sackbear says, I just finished Lord of the Ring on Audible. A Throne of Bones now is refreshing, coherent battles. Finally, well, enjoy it. I hope you do enjoy it. We got more battles in the Sea of Skulls too. I think in part they're talking about the EU as well. Absolutely, but the EU. The EU is a U.S. satrapy. It's literally people that are funded and installed by the neoclowns. And so, that's breaking up too. That's falling apart too. People are confused. People are really confused because the degradation of the dialectic and the incoherence of the rhetoric leaves people deeply confused. Because remember, most people don't really think, and they're not really capable of keeping track of more than a binary. All they want to know is who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. But they can't get that anymore from the mainstream, despite the mainstream's best effort to program them, because of the incoherencies. So, and that's why we're seeing all this, crazy stuff and inconsistent stuff. And, for me, the really interesting thing is the way that China just keeps quietly making its headway, quietly moving forward. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when China actually decides to make an overt move. Hooten says, both my liberal and conservative family members are completely lost. Yeah, it's understandable. These are new and different and confusing times. They just cannot get what's going on and shut down mentally. That's not surprising. This is beyond their capacity to fathom. Remember, back when this started, people were thinking that it was actually um, just about Russia and Ukraine and Putin wanting to be a new Tsar. I mean, that was obviously wrong, but a lot of people bought that. And so if you started from that point of view, how do you make sense of anything? You know, where did where did Ukraine even get its second army, right? Cliff Cosmic says, why did Clown World think Americans would support them after they made everything gay and ugly? Because they thought that their word magic was strong enough. The word magic and the threats they thought was strong enough. But, you know, the seeds of failure are planted in the fields of success. Just because it worked before, just because it worked 10 times in a row, doesn't mean it's going to work the 11th time. My Booster Patrol compadre is here. He said, hey, Chief, how's the Sea of Skulls thing going? It's going pretty well. I'm hoping to have the first draft finished the end of the month here. Still optimistic about that. Then it goes to the readers, make the adjustments, but it should go pretty quickly once they read through it. It's going to take them a little while to read through it. It's 900 pages, but, you know. Idaho Crusader says, I expect there to be boomers that literally die of shock at what's going to happen to the U.S. Well, shock plus the vax, I suppose. I heard a rumor about the U.S. appropriating European gold reserves. They're appropriating reserves. I don't know if they're appropriating European reserves because I think that those are mostly in London. But when will A Sea of Skulls be available to non-Castalia people? Depends on how quickly we're able to get through, the proofreading and that process. So, can you provide an update of shipping of History Sub to Australia? Not yet. We're working on. We're literally working on international shipping today. We're waiting on some offers from the companies that we've been talking to. The rhetoric insisting the U.S. economy is invulnerable and can overcome anything is insane. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's rhetoric. Remember, there's no informational value in rhetoric. All that is a coping mechanism. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous to look at the current situation and think that the USA in its present form can survive it. It can't. It absolutely can't. So, anyhow, that's all I've got for tonight. But thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the beautiful leather back there. We're going to have some test meditations available. And in fact, 10 of them will probably be gilded as well, just because we need to test gilding how we bind the gilded books. So, but yes, it's totally true that Cullencut says what was true in the 1940s isn't true after generations of degradation, brainwashing, and adulteration. Bishop sends a super chat, says awesome. Thank you, Bishop. By the way, I did hear from somebody that is frankly already kind of working on the kind of tutorial channel that we discussed the other night. I don't know, they're already kind of embedded a bit in YouTube. So I don't know whether that works out because I want something that focuses on UATV, where UATV is the focus and not the, just the safe haven. Um, so we'll see. Uh, Vox, can we buy a meditations copy? Yeah, just email me. We'll put you on the list. I think we've got like 20 people that are signed up for it so far. So we'll have plenty. I don't know what the price is, but the price is going to basically be, you know, essentially, break even plus the few percent. Um, you know, we just want to recoup, the expenses and all. So, should I be receiving books for the $50 subscription subscribed in January? No, not yet. Although we are working on a solution for that because I want it. I want to come up with something so that when people first subscribe, they get something right away. So we're working on figuring that out. But um, yeah, everybody likes the idea of a tutorial channel at Unauthorized. The question is, do we want it? Do we want to have overload on YouTube, or or what? Cliff Cosmic says every YouTube tutorial eventually has, now use your $300,000 CNC machine. Hey, they get big, they get popular, they can buy nice tools, you know. Um, Anyhow, we'll see how it goes. Um, but thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next one. I'm Vox Day, and this is the Darkstream.